Welcome to B2B Commerce Corner. Commerce Corner is a sub-series of the E-commerce Edge podcast discussing all things B2B commerce through the lens of agencies, consultants, merchants, and more. Enjoy. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of The Pod. It is my pleasure to welcome to you today Mr. Ralph Merhi, and he is from Erp.Aero out of West Palm Beach, Florida. Welcome to the podcast, Ralph.
Hi, how are you? Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for joining me for this conversation today. I wanted to get you on specifically to talk about Erp.Aero because what I'm seeing starting to emerge in the B2B world, in the B2B sales world, is a ton of verticalized SaaS software, right? And that's what I would absolutely consider Erp.Aero. You're a full SaaS ERP platform, but it is a purpose-built
Absolutely.
ERP platform for aviation distribution, logistics, and MRO. And
Correct.
so as a result of that, I would put you in that bucket of verticalized SaaS software. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about why you feel you're the CEO. You're not the founder of the company, but you are the CEO of the company. And I think you've obviously been with the company long enough now to really understand the guts of it. You've been there over a
Correct.
year and a half now, and you've been in the business long enough to understand how they operate, how the founders think, how the industry works, etc. And I'd love to initially get your take on why you feel that there has been this emergence of vertical specific SaaS software, say over the last 2 to 5 years, where everything is just perfectly tailored for a given business or industry.
It's an easy answer, but it's also very complicated. So I'm going to do my best to try to explain it the way that I understood. I won't get into too much about me first, but as you mentioned, I've been in this industry for about 20 years and I joined Erp.Aero about 18 or 19 months ago, having had a couple of benefits. Number one, exposure to the industry, and it was primarily aerospace and defense, but aviation was still in there, and exposure to a lot of these products that go in these various buckets that you're talking about. And as I tell everybody, I came to Erp.Aero for two reasons. Number one, the people, which are the founders, and we'll talk about them. And number two, the product. Aviation is the smallest big industry or the biggest small industry, however you really want to look at it. It's so huge, but everybody knows everybody. But based on the rules and based on the regulations and everything that goes with it, it gets pretty specific. Before I get into a little bit more, I'll tell you this. So if you take ISO or ASA standards or even AS standards, they're not really open to interpretation. So when you start to look in on aviation and what aviation needs, there's a lot of things that you can do at the peripherals, but when you get right down to managing the business, you just need to be able to get from A to B to C the right way and in ways that you can recall so you can prove how you got there. So there had been a couple, getting back to your question, there had been a couple of providers that have been doing this for a very long time. And all of us owe them a lot of things because they opened the door for many of us to come into here. But the needs of aviation and technology as a whole started to advance in a way that sort of outpaced what it did prior to, let's say, 5 or 6 years ago. The trajectory sort of just went straight up, and that opened up the industry, or they opened up the technology to bring in a lot of players that can either do A and B only, or A through Z, or anything in between. So the competition started coming up. And then when you look specifically, we came into the picture as a company right around that 5 or 6 year period that you just mentioned. But instead of one of the differences, and one of the reasons I think we are excelling, and a lot of companies that are excelling can relate to, they're not trying to solve every problem. And that's not what we're trying to do. We are, as you called it, 100% aviation, aerospace, and defense, aviation related, which is managed by three standards that go a long way: ISO, AS for manufacturers, and ASA for distributors and suppliers. And getting from A to B to C, it's not hard, but it's not easy. Going back to some of the older solutions that used to exist, the newer solutions came out, they were cloud. The older solutions weren't. They tried to convert. Easier technology was written so that you can, so that a company can do an entire process without having to manage or remanage things that it's already done. And then where it really stands out is we didn't retrofit something that had been going around for 10 or 15 or 20 years. And a lot of companies try to do the same too. And we built something from scratch. When you are going after RFQs in order to manage your business, for example, you need to be able to answer the RFQs very quickly. You need to be able to get all of your RFQs in the same place, and you need to be able to take the potential transaction throughout the process so you're the fastest to get to the invoice. From order to cash, and that's what you need to do. So by what I've been trying to get around to is saying, so once we remove all of the things out of the way that sort of stand in the way of you getting from order to cash in the same place, you get there pretty fast. And a lot of companies tried to do that, and then we saw quite a few of them come up in the last few years. And as I mentioned, we were one of them. And essentially, that's the reason. That's one of the reasons why I think we exist, and a lot of companies in our universe exist.
And it's interesting because I think aviation is a little bit like weddings, right? You can have the same stainless steel bolt that would go into a deck, and then all of a sudden you now make it aviation grade, and it's 1,000 times the cost for the same maybe tensile strength bolt, for example. And it's the same with weddings. So you put a wedding before any other, like a cake, you put the word wedding before a cake, and it's going to cost you 10 times as much as the equivalent cake, right? Because it's for weddings. And I also, so first of all, we're dealing with an industry that has very expensive componentry. It has very industry specific componentry. And as you rightly point out, this componentry is heavily regulated. It is heavily certified. It is heavily tested. You can't just go out there with your, and it's similar to, I guess, like marine. Marine is a very different thing. You have marine stainless versus aviation stainless. They are two different standards and they're manufactured in two different ways. And so
Correct.
the interesting thing about this is I have seen over the years that industries like aviation, like marine, they will oftentimes have these vertical specific products, but you'll still see in some distribution companies in these verticals or some of the manufacturing companies in these verticals, they will try to adapt something like a NetSuite, or they'll try to adapt something like a D365, or they'll try to adapt some Oracle, some sort of Oracle ERP, something like that. They will try to take a quote unquote generic ERP and they will try to tailor it for their specific vertical or industry needs. Now, oftentimes that means they're paying for stuff they don't need because it's not useful for their industry, or they're needing to add a bunch of stuff they do need to that default
Correct.
solution, which costs a small fortune, and they launch with a lot of technical debt as a result that they then have to maintain. So, is that kind of the direction that the founders of this company went in? They said, look, sure, you could use an off the shelf solution like a NetSuite, but you're going to have to customize and tailor it quite substantially for our industry. And you're probably going to be paying for a bunch of stuff you don't need. So why don't you use our solution instead? You get all the things you do need, a bunch of stuff you don't. You're not going to get anything you don't. And therefore, we can keep the costs down because we're so vertical specific. We're not trying to be all things to all people. We're trying to be all things to the aerospace distribution and manufacturing industry, and that's it. And that's what we're working towards. And is that the sense that you got when the founders went to, because building an ERP is no small undertaking, a massive undertaking. It's a far larger code base for an ERP than, say, just an e-commerce platform. And I know you guys do commerce as well, but so it is no small undertaking. And to want to undertake that, you have to have pretty high confidence that the market needs your solution before you start building,
Correct.
right?
Absolutely on the money. So there's a lot of things I can say about that, and I hope I can answer a lot of the things that came out in that comment. A little bit more about the origin of the story. The founders had been in aviation for 15 or 20 years respectively. The founders were using an old deprecated product that doesn't exist anymore, and then it got deprecated and they started to search for an existing solution to give them the workflows and the controls and the ability to flow through transactions the way they wanted to. And they couldn't find it. They tried them. It doesn't really matter who, but they tried them one after the other and they were coming up short. So their initial kick was to develop something that they can use. And it worked for a short period of time, but once the MVP was fully developed, they started showing it around in the industry, and it went above and beyond what people were expecting. It did go above and beyond what they were trying to build. Now, before I get back to this for a second, I'll just give you an analog to what I just said without getting into too many details. In my previous life, I had a team. It wasn't just a one man job, but we built a SaaS solution for aerospace and defense companies that took care of everything on the procurement side and everything on the research side. The
Oh,
to- at the time, there were quite a few providers offering components of what we tried to build. And that need, the ability to go after customers and ask them what they're looking for and find out where current solutions come up short and then build new solutions or altered solution to get those customers from A to B, allowed me to be building a company that graduated to over 3,000 customers by 2022. And that's the analog between what I was trying to say to you before. So the founders found a problem, and they built a solution initially to make their business go from A to B faster. And then it ended up bringing in a lot more traffic. So right before COVID, unfortunately, they went to market, and then everybody else in the world dealt with everything that happened at and since COVID. But the company caught on. There was traction. They brought in a customer, then they brought in five, then they brought in another five, and so on. And the company began to grow. But it was just the two guys with the development team, and they bootstrapped everything up until the time when I came in about 18 months ago. So selfishly, as I mentioned before, I saw the same opportunity that I can try to be a part of that I had in my previous company, people I like, and a product that I think knows how to kick butt. And that's where my past experiences jumped in and allowed me to be able to make that distinction and to make that analysis to be able to want to be a part of. And that's exactly what we saw. But you're right. The industry is heavily regulated and it has its moments and other times it doesn't. But ultimately, we're dealing with a subject matter where lives are at stake. So it has to be well regulated. It has to be structured and it has to be a manufacturing process that is repeatable time and time again with the ability to oversee current processes so that the next person doesn't feel like they're less important than the next person after that after they go on. And it makes a lot of sense. So taking that personal experience, asking people around exactly what they need and what they couldn't get, that's what helped the company build to the way it built to where it became when I first came in. But ultimately, after that, all we needed to do is take what we have and exponentially accelerate the messaging, the industry authority, and the product that we were developing in order to capture a bigger piece. And we talked a little bit at the beginning of the conversation about everybody jumping in and making a market where there's too many providers trying to solve the same problem. But that's exactly what happens. And then all of a sudden, you go from 20 new providers to 10 new providers. You go from 10 to 4 or 5. And those are the people that run away because they're not too specific where they can't solve certain problems. And they're not overly general where you need to pay an obscene amount of money in order to tailor the workflows, in order to tailor the processes to fit to what the company needs. The benefit of aviation, as I mentioned ago, it's a repeatable process. So once you find out how to go from one point to the other faster, more effectively, and for less money, it's easy to run away with that. And some of those companies didn't figure that out, and others are trying to figure it out as we speak. We're just in the middle trying to take advantage of it.
I love that. And most vertical SaaS software vendors have a very well-defined ICP, whether that be SMB, whether that be mid-market, whether that be
Correct.
high-end enterprise. So when you think about your software, was that one of the things when you first came into the business that you had to get real ultra clear on was who is our ICP? Is it the small one, two,
Correct.
three component manufacturer down the road with a small factory? Or is it Boeing? And there's a huge scope in between the single or multi-component manufacturer and a Boeing. And so you need to know where you're the best fit. Now, you might not be able to serve a Boeing today. 10 years from now, you might be able to. But in the short to medium term, you have to know where you're the best fit. So was that one of the things that you helped the founders to refine was, hey, where can we win? Where can we move the needle the fastest? which businesses can afford us, and where's that Zen spot, that Venn diagram where we fit right in the middle, that sweet spot of affordability, feature completeness.
That was one of the first things I jumped into. So, as I mentioned a minute ago, they were fortunate enough to build a company and get it to 2024 in the state that it was, in the condition that it was, and with the customer base that we had at the time. But yes, that's one of the first shifts. That's one of the first revelations that we had to go through collectively as an executive team and as salespeople of the company, because we do both. It's easy to say we're an aviation ERP. That means everybody in aviation gets to fit, and it doesn't. It really doesn't. So we had to define and redefine that sweet spot that you were talking about, and it became more and more evident. So instead of a total addressable market that we can't touch anywhere today or tomorrow, we found out how much of that market is serviceable, and most of that was actually between small and medium companies, anywhere between 5 and 10 and maybe 50 and 60 immediate users that were specifically in aviation supply, which means brokering, which means part sales, distribution, direct or stock distribution, as well as repair facilities and MROs. So what they both had in common was the size of the company, but being able to define the exact candidate that would be a perfect fit for Erp.Aero is what took shape early on in 2024 after I joined. And that sort of cleared up a lot of things, because you're right. We're not going after the enterprise that has 1,500 users to show them how to better manage an RFQ or a part. We're going after the tiers one, tiers two, and three suppliers, as well as repair shops and companies in between that have that immediate need to be able to turn over RFQs, to consolidate all of their demand into one inbox versus many inboxes, and be able to get them there faster. And then, as we kept on showing them how the process can be improved again and again, that number stood out as the sweet spot. And now we actively go after companies that are either in repair or supply in aviation, and that average between 10 and about 50 or 60 users. And those are the ones that have the most need for what you do. And that's exactly.
It's so interesting that you thought of that through the lens of users. Now, that because most of the businesses that I deal with, they think in terms of revenue, annual revenue, right? They go, okay, cool. We can service a company that's doing between $50 million a year and $1 billion a year in revs, and that's our sweet spot. So that leads me to believe, and I'm sure you'll correct me if I'm wrong, that the price that you charge out for your platform is based on a combination of maybe base modules plus monthly user fees for the number of
Correct.
users that you've got logging in to the system. So is that why you start thinking about the number of users that would be using the system, and that helps to determine the scale of businesses that are a good fit and who can afford you versus saying a pure revenue number? Because the reality is, in the aviation industry, I'm guessing it's like a lot of industries, in that we're talking very high dollar amounts, but the margins may not reflect.
Correct.
You might have, like, in general industrial wholesale distribution, for example, they might be a $500 million a year business, but they might be operating on 3% net margins. And if you just looked at the 500 million or $1 billion businesses, you'd think, oh my God, they're making a lot of money every year. But when you break it down by percentage, maybe not. And so
Correct.
is that why, instead of putting a revenue number on it, you said, no, let's look at this through the lens of how many users do you need logging into a system like ours to get your job done every day?
The short answer, if I'm going to cheat, is to tell you that I did all of the above. The slightly longer answer has to do with how many people can get their hands on the software today. I don't want to dumb it down for myself, but you tell me $100 million company, that's a big company, but what does that mean? What does
Yes.
that mean to go after $100 million company? You mentioned an example where they might be $100 million company, but they're working on 2 or 3% net margins. How do I figure out exactly what that ends up just based on the general information? So it doesn't really make sense to me. Additionally, that $100 million company could potentially have 800, 1,200, 700, or 1,000 employees. Those are not the people that fit my targeted persona and ideal customer profile. The actual people that do the repairs, that manage procurement, that do the purchasing, that stock the parts, receive the parts, inspect the parts, that's the target that I'm going after. So it didn't matter. It's freed us a little bit And I cheated. I figured that out by dumb luck probably years ago when I was building the other product, that it didn't matter revenue a company was making. What mattered for me 10 years ago was how much of their business was concentrated in government procurement.
Mhm.
That's what I needed to know. It didn't matter that they did retail, it didn't matter that they did marine, it didn't matter that they did anything else. So take that percentage of that business that did government contracting, and those are the ones that we pursued and did that very successfully. So the inclination to follow the same strategy starting in 2024 was a little bit using luck and a little bit using past experience, but something that made total sense. And that sort of changed the dynamics. Based on that Venn diagram that you talked about before, if you also take a look at the total addressable market versus the serviceable market, again, I'm looking at that Venn diagram where they actually intersect, because that's what made the most sense to me, and that's where we come in and help. So yes, there's a lot of value add. We diminish or decrease rather the number of things and services that our customers have to use because we offer more out of the box. And yes, as you said before, it is a combination of monthly user fees and some sort of implementation fee. But the rest of it is pretty simple. It's built to function for aviation, whether it's supply, manufacturing, or repair, and it follows the rules and regulations for those industries that make the company compliant with ASA, and ISO. Having that already done, we don't have to tailor your invoices to fit a certain standard because we already do. So we don't take that empty shell and make it just big enough for you to use it. What we do is we take what we have and teach you how to use the things that are important to you. And couple that with going after what I still believe is the right target, I think has been tremendous for us in the last 12 to 18 months.
And if you just look at the distribution side of the industry, first of all, are you targeting just the United States? Are you targeting international firms that work in this space that fit your ICP? And are the rules and regulations within the US, like for example, we have general privacy laws in the United States, then we got California, then we got the GDPR in Europe. Very different, right? And so the expectations in each global market can be slightly different, right? And the needs in each global market can be slightly different. Now, I know
Correct.
international, I know aviation, and much like marine, has a level of international standard, and therefore maybe it makes it a little bit easier to go international. But when you think about internationalization, how does that impact your product roadmap? That's the first question. And then the second question is distribution specifically versus manufacturing or maintenance. How do you think about, because oftentimes distributors, that's a really unique requirement set all on its own, very independent of manufacturing and maintenance. So, how do you break up those three buckets when you're thinking about your product roadmap?
The first part is relatively simple. I don't want to say easy because it's not, but it's relatively simple. So when you talk about aerospace, when you talk about aviation and defense companies, especially in the space, not necessarily outside of the space, they're either in the US, which we do service, and about 60% of our customer base is US based, and they're about 40% international, and about 40% of our customers are also international companies. But the good part about them is super simple. At least I think it is. In the US, it's the FAA. That's what sets the rules and regulations. And I don't know what it was like 50 years ago, but I can tell you that as far back as I remember, in Europe, it's EASA. So now you've got these two agencies that maybe are not in lockstep 100% of the time, but they're close enough as to where they're looking out for people the same way or almost the same way, different ways to get there. But the saving grace, at least based on what I understood from the question, is still the actual standards that the companies have to follow. Whether
Yes.
the companies are in the US or whether they are in Germany or the UK or anywhere else. ISO standards are international.
Yep.
AS standards are international. And ASA, which governs most of for supply, is also international. So when you take those things put together, yes, in terms of how we communicate with a certain population, GDPR. But what we say in that communication and the strength of the service that we offer doesn't get altered by geographic location. And that helps us a lot. That helps us tremendously. And that's where a lot of that sort of comes in.
Yeah, makes sense. I know that, for example, down in Querétaro, down here in Mexico, that massive aerospace manufacturing hub for North America, full stop. There's a lot of aerospace manufacturers down in Querétaro, and some in Nuevo León and Monterrey. A few other places in Mexico are very famous for both vehicle and aerospace manufacturing. And yeah, I was always wondering how that impacted the vertical SaaS when we're talking about potentially different countries with different rules, different regs, et cetera. But yeah, international regulations are pretty important when you're talking an industry
Correct.
as big and as impactful as aviation. Now, when we think of those three ICP buckets, maybe the relatively small or medium-sized manufacturer, that you're not going
Hmm.
to be a massive manufacturer, a mid-sized distributor with less than 150 users of your software, or MRO and maintenance operations. Also, I'm guessing that when it comes to maintenance, then you're targeting like maintenance service providers that are based at relatively small regional airports, for example, as opposed to the massive ones operating out of international airports or international service centers, for example, in Dubai, where they outsource a lot of maintenance, heavy maintenance for things like Boeing
Hmm.
aircraft, etc. I guess you don't necessarily want to play in that heavy maintenance space. It's probably more, okay, here's our mid-size maintenance players for, say, for example, light aircraft maintenance companies, as opposed to Boeing level maintenance companies. Would that be right?
So it makes perfect sense. So if you take the company, for example, that has their FBO directly in Miami International Airport, their requirements and their day-to-day changes a little bit. But if you want to break it down by craft type, size, and everything else, there's a lot of overlap. So your small repair organization is also working on 747, 757 parts, Airbus parts. Your slightly bigger or more regional repair facilities as well are doing some of the same things. Where they become different is, I think, where they fit into the hierarchy of the relationship. So for a distributor, who are you selling to and who are they selling to? For a repair company, how many people typically find you and how many people do you go after? And what is the relative size of the companies that you guys do business with? All of those come in. But the really super nice part, I think, about the way that we do things is Erp.Aero doesn't take supply and put it in a silo. It doesn't take repair and put it in a silo, or let's say, I don't know, integrations and reporting and put it in another silo. Most, if not all of them, are interconnected. And I'll give you some general examples. Our customers can answer, for example, any RFQ from any source in one screen, one Unibox. You don't need multiple services to get your RFQs. Our repair shops can actually buy the parts that they need for repairs directly from the work order. So they don't need to pass it on to a procurement department that's going to pass it on to the purchasing department and back and forth. So all of those things are related. And then when you start talking about regulations and compliance, both those sides are also interconnected. If you buy a part, you need traceability, where it came from, where it's been. The older you have it, the better. And when you repair the part, you need the same thing. So they're sharing a common, I don't want to call it a
Record, like
database
a maintenance
record.
record.
Thank you. Thank you. I don't know why I drew a blank on that. So they're sharing that base record for a lot of things, but they're using it in different ways. So when you start to look at all of the interconnected parts, it brings it all in. And it does, like you said, separate a little bit the heavy maintenance facility that maybe is in Miami versus the regional repair that is in West Palm Beach, or smaller companies in the middle. But they're all connected in one way, shape, or form. However many degrees different from each other, I don't know. But some of them are very clear, and others you have to think about.
And I guess there's probably a network of subcontractors that also, like, for example, if I own a heavy maintenance facility in Miami, I may also need some, depending on the surge capacity that I need, I may not be able to do everything out of my facility. And
Correct.
therefore, maybe I subcontract elements or components
Correct.
of that out to regionalized maintenance facilities. And then I bring it back together in Miami, reassemble it in Miami, and then put it back on the aircraft in
Correct.
Miami, for example. But those smaller shops, they may not be just servicing light aircraft. They might be servicing heavy aircraft in a subcontract capacity.
Correct. And a lot of these shops, small, medium, and large, they may not do repairs directly, but they do repair management. So instead of trading parts, they're trading repair capabilities. I know that's not the right way to say it, but that's the closest I can say it in plain language. If I had the experience to do repairs, for example, specifically, I don't have to have a shop. I can set up shop where companies like yours, for example, sends me the repair RFQ.
Yep.
I take the repair RFQ and I price it out between three, four, or five other actual repair shops.
Hmm.
I pick the one that allows me the best margin and the quickest turnaround time. I quote you, you send me the part, I receive it, send it out, it gets repaired, it comes back to me, and then I send it to you, or it can be shipped directly over to you. So there's a lot to go around. Subcontracting is a really good way to say it, but that language specifically was more in line with defense, which is what I used to do before. But it's the same thing. It's the same thing by another name. So a lot of these companies are doing repair management, and that's another point of contact that they each have with each other. It's a huge industry, and it's such a small industry. I know I've said that, but it's so true.
Yeah, it's like B2B e-commerce, full stop. Like it's a massive industry. It's a multi-trillion-dollar industry, but there's only a few major players in it, both from an e-commerce platform perspective, also from a supplier perspective. In specific verticals, there's a limited number of suppliers in a given vertical, and I'm guessing it's the same in aviation with the pure number of distributors that are out there. It's a very capital intensive industry.
Yes.
The reality is that I guess if you're going to go into aircraft, aviation, distribution of parts, man, you better have some reasonably deep pockets because
You
it's
do.
going to get pretty expensive pretty fast. And the problem is also that space is a consideration, not just cost of the goods, but the size of some of these components is so large that you need very large warehousing space for a
Correct.
lot of aircraft components. And then is there much cross? I'm guessing that there is some cross compatibility of some components. Obviously, if it's a M3 aircraft grade bolt, then it's an M3 bolt, right? But then there are other components that are very type specific, in which case
Correct.
that starts to get into areas of specialization that does distribution handle that, or in most cases are those components coming directly from the manufacturer?
That's a really good question, and I'll answer it the best way that I can. And it's both. It all depends on where something is in its overall life cycle. So, to give you an example, unrelated, but I think it'll make sense right away, drug companies spend billions of dollars to develop a drug, and then after a certain amount of time, it becomes generic. Again, Boeing and all of them, they spent billions of dollars developing crafts, assemblies, components, and things in between. And for the longest time, they are the main provider for service and or parts or both. But as time goes by, the demand goes down, maybe demand changes. More people can find the product in the market now, and then you don't have to go directly to the OEM in order to buy it. What you're doing is buying the same part from somebody else, so long as there's traceability for it. Or depending on what application or assembly you have, maybe you're buying aftermarket parts like PMA parts that
Hmm.
have been overseen and certified, for the lack of a better word, by the FAA to have the same form, fit, and function and the same way of being built. Again, I can't think out loud, but it's all over the place. The point I'm trying to make is all over the place. It all depends on where it is in that overall life cycle, whether it's a brand new, still supported by the OEM component, or whether it's an aftermarket that's been around forever, and then the supply chain can handle demand from different places.
And how large or small or common is the secondhand market in aviation? Obviously, we see deserts with parked up aircraft that have either been retired or they can't, especially during COVID, we shut down a lot of aircraft because we just weren't doing as much flying. And it feels like, when an aircraft is brand new to market, then obviously a lot of that supply has to come from the OEM manufacturer of the product. But the older an aircraft gets, the more that are retired from operations, the more that can be broken down for spares, the more that have had a chance for third parties to make equivalent parts for it. I think of it almost like automotive. Like it's the same
It
cycle
is.
with automotive. Brand new vehicles, you got to get most of the spares directly from a dealer.
Correct.
Then once a model's been out for 5 or 10 years, cool. The aftermarket comes to the party, and now I can get
Right.
aftermarket spares. Then we are starting to get wrecks. We're able to get certain parts from wreckers that are hard to get either aftermarket or from OEM. So
Mhm.
feel like aircraft go through a not identical but a very similar sort of a
Similar.
life cycle.
They do. They actually very well do. It's such an easy analogy to do, just like it happens in automotive, just like it happens in marine. It happens obviously in aviation. But back to your first question, the aftermarket size is in the tens of billions of dollars, depending on where you read or what reports you're actually going after. But it's a multi-billion dollar industry. industry, and there is a lot of supply. Depending on which components, depending on what there might be more of in the market, a lot of them are stocked very deeply, and then a lot of them are not in demand. And just like you, I've looked at pictures in the desert of planes just stack on top of each other and wonder how we can do that. But in the big picture, that's such a small piece of the entire aftermarket, where maybe it didn't make sense for those planes stocked in the desert somewhere or stored in the desert somewhere, but it doesn't make sense for something else, whether it's the new Airbus or the 787 or the 777, where demand is still there. And every one of these crafts is going through regular maintenance, because just like manufacturing for defense in the government, in aviation, every person that gets on that plane deserves the same protection that the previous person did. So the part has to be exactly the same. The procedure has to be the same. The standard, how it was stored, has to be the same. All the paperwork that you have from now all the way back to birth and everything in between has to be the same. And that's what usually drives the market.
Wow, amazing. And is there anything that your customers, whether that be the manufacturers, the distributors, the maintenance companies, is there anything that they're asking for that you don't yet do? Or is there anything, if you were to look out at the market over the next 6, 12, 18 months, is there anything as a big opportunity for you guys that you go, we don't do that today, but talk to me again in 6 months and we will be, because we're going after this new opportunity in the market?
Correct. So the short answer is yes. I started with a company 18, 19 months ago. We had a 24, 30-month roadmap, right? How the product was going to look. 20 months later, we have a 36-month roadmap, and the majority of that roadmap looks different than it did 2 years ago because times change. And I'll give you a couple of examples. Take a lot of the technology that's coming out. There's a big hoopla around
Of
AI
course.
this and AI that. And I was one of them. But when it first came out, I used it the way that I understood how, and it gave me so okay answers. And then I learned how to use it better, and so on and so forth. And that same technology goes through a similar life cycle inside of products. And what I mean by that is, because it's such a buzzword, all that you have to do practically is slap an AI moniker on your product, and it's supposed to attract a lot of these customers. But that's hype. It comes and it goes, and it comes and it goes. Where we saw a huge difference, especially in the since last May, so maybe almost a year, 10 months ago, is in that AI, but how we applied the AI. Instead of actually just adding something that is a conditional automation and calling it AI, we added agentic services and agents into the platform to help you accomplish a job better. AI went in there and helped us capture, for example, your RFQs from 10 different places or 20 different places within a blink of an eye. So you don't need to go and have 16 connections or 4 services that are helping the aggregation. We also, instead of just, again, I keep you going back to conditional automation because that's what it's not. We built an intelligent AI layer on top of RFQs. We built it on top of the CRM, and we built it on top of inventory. So you can actually have a conversation with your customer accounts. You can have a conversation with your RFQs, and you can uncover information that you may not have seen. But that's not the benefit. Where that's exciting is this, and let me see if I can say this the right way. I've been in this industry for a while. I've been in sales for a long while. And in the times of my experience or my career where I've been in leadership, I've always wanted all of my teams to perform at their very best, but usually operated by the 80-20 or the 10-90 rule, which means your top 20% carried pretty much 80% of all production that was coming in. And I always struggled with how can I equalize that? But that's the power of some of this new technology, because all of the stuff that I just talked about with CRM, RFQs, and inventory, it is helping our customers make their bottom 90% perform like their top 10%. You take these components that are embedded, that are ingrained in the workflow, and then you teach them. So whether it's machine learning, training, or a combination of the two, now all of a sudden your 10 people that kick butt are really kicking butt because they're making decisions faster. They might have to recall less, but they are in those positions where they're getting the help that they need. And I think that's part of what we're about to see next. We're nowhere close to being done, us as a company or the industry as a whole. So I think the quicker and the smarter we're able to evolve from the current iteration to the next and to the next determines what happens after that. So yeah, technology is a big mover over the last year, and it's going to be a huge mover in the coming 12, 24 months and beyond that.
And when do you think that the industry is going to be able to keep up with demand? I know this is crystal ball gazing, but what I mean by that is during COVID, there was pronouncements of doom that every airline was going to go out of business and people were going to stop traveling. And then once aviation came back, it was going to be so expensive, only the ultra wealthy would be able to travel, and then they would mostly be doing it by private jet. And so therefore, our public airlines are going to all die. Airlines are going to die. They talked about airports dying. From what I've seen post COVID, there is not an airport that I go to today, and I traveled a lot last year. Probably I traveled more in 2025 than I think I have in any year prior to that.
Me
And I
too.
tell you, literally every single airport and every single airline that we used in 2025 was full. There
Mhm.
was every single airport. It was hard to get around. It was hard to find flights. And at the times that we needed and to the destinations we needed, it just feels like aviation is absolutely not only is it not going away, but it feels like demand still far outstrips supply. Yet we still have airlines going out of business, and so it feels like this strange dichotomy where margins are super thin in the aviation industry, but it feels like demand is higher than it's ever been.
It is. It absolutely is. And there's a lot of the math that doesn't make sense. You're right. Airlines going out of business. How does that happen? Let's break it down a little bit. Let me start from the beginning, real quick, to give you a couple of the thoughts that went through my head. I'm old enough to have been around when the internet first came out, right? 95, 96. And the fear at the time was the internet was going to take everybody's jobs. It didn't. It
Yeah.
made some jobs obsolete and it created a ton of other jobs. I say that because I think that's the technology revolution we're currently going through. A lot of people are afraid they're going to be made obsolete, and some might. But for the most part, we're also going to create so many more things that we couldn't imagine yesterday.
Yep.
Couple that with the demand that still exists. It doesn't matter if the economy is good, not good, great, or somewhere in between today. People are still leading good lives. People still want to travel. Companies still want to send their people to trade shows to meet customers. People still want to go on vacation. And that's where it becomes a problem from where I started a minute ago. I think some airlines are going out of business because you can't pay as much as you can for gas today and charge less for the ticket than you did 10 years ago. A lot of people might listen to what I just said and want to throw something at me because they don't want to overpay. But there's a reason everything has a cost. And there are a lot of things associated with that cost. Number one is the health of the company. What are their margins? If you sell $1 billion worth of tickets, but it's costing you 1.01 billion to run the company, you're in the negative. And that has to be rethought. But one of the problems we've dealt with as people is that we all want what we want. And we want it today, no matter what. And it better work the way that we go after it, or else. But that's not reality. And some of the stuff that I just talked about catch up with us. There's a reason why I think you can fly from A to B for $330 or $540 with another airline or $610 with a third airline. So for me as a consumer, I want to pay the least amount of money. But as a business, I want to be able to offer my services today and tomorrow. And ultimately, that demand that you asked about, I don't think demand's going to go away. I think technology is going to put us in a place where we handle the demand faster, and then other requirements and other needs are going to come up, create a vacuum where the technology is going to come in and fill in that void, and it's going to be a repeatable process. But I don't think it'll stop anytime soon. I think that was a very long way of telling you I don't think it'll stop anywhere soon.
And I guess and I asked that question very specifically for a very specific reason, which is I think as technology, of course, the price of Jet A1 is going to be the thing that dictates profitability. It probably defines like 70 to 80% of the profitability of an
Right.
airline, for example, or a freight carrier, for example. The price of Jet A1 is the number one thing that impacts the bottom line, right? And everything trickles down from there. But technology is also a massive cost line item for all of
Absolutely.
these companies. And if you can save even 1% or 2% or 3% in the bad old days of 8% of revenue IT budgets, then a lot of these businesses they don't survive, right? In the modern era where 4%, 3 or 4% of revenue is an IT budget now, that is probably much more sustainable for a
It
lot
is.
more businesses. And so what I meant by that is that as new technology like yours that it wasn't built on legacy, you came to market in 2019. You don't have 100 years of legacy in your technology that you've got to deal with,
Correct.
right? And as a result of that, being multi-tenant SaaS, native cloud, the reality is you can scale better, your customers can scale better, you
Correct.
can bring your prices down. And so therefore, every single person that touches that aviation value chain along the way using your technology, their costs go down. And as a result of that,
Significantly.
therefore their profitability goes up, therefore their sustainability goes up, therefore their pricing to their customers can go down and they can still remain viable. And so therefore we have technology can be deflationary. And that is one of the biggest promises I think of AI is the deflationary impact of AI on a given market
Right.
because we do it smarter, faster, and easier and cheaper ultimately at the end of the day. So I guess I said all that to say that I would assume that technology like yours actually helps keep some of these businesses viable that would struggle to be viable any other way because you so dramatically decrease their, like, for example, if they were to go and buy an ERP from Oracle, that,
Correct.
I don't know, just pull a number out of my backside, that might cost them $1 million a year. Whereas for yours, it might cost them, again, just pulling a number out of my backside because I don't know what your prices are, it might only cost them 250 grand a year. Cool. That's a significant decrease in operating costs to go from Oracle to Erp.Aero. So I feel like that is going to keep some of these companies viable that may not otherwise be able to be.
It's actually a really good point, and I know I veered off track a little bit, but I'm glad that you brought it back to the middle. But that's absolutely correct. So if you take all of the technical debt, right? If you take all of the technical debt that a 20, 30, 40-year-old company has, whether it's a provider like we are or whether it's a consumer like a lot of companies out there, one of the reasons they're having a hard time catching up, and one of the reasons some of them are still struggling, is because it costs them significantly more to convert that old to new tech. It costs them a lot to change it. I don't want to say who or why, but I dealt with or spoke with an OEM, I don't know, 6 or 7 months ago, that is currently content with using their old Cobalt base back end that they developed over 21 years ago because they just don't know how to reproduce that technology to make it more modern. And they're having a hard time being able to fit in to some of these newer places. So I don't know, they create digital twins, they try to work off of digital twins, and that costs a lot of money. But in that same rush 4 or 5 years ago that we talked about earlier, that caused a lot of providers to try to come up with new solutions, where Erp.Aero was one of those new providers, you're absolutely on the money because we don't have that technical debt. So we didn't build 19 stories only to use two. We didn't just develop product and take up back end infrastructure just to say that we're in business. We're cloud native, 100% out there. So every penny that we save goes straight towards our cost, our implementation, and it's a benefit to our customers. And you're right, maybe the $1 million, $200,000 is not the right example, but it is close. It's super close. We can have your average ideal customer of mine, which is a small or medium aviation supply and or repair company, anywhere between, let's say, 5 and 50 users. We can have that company up and running in 90 days, fully trained, implemented, fully migrated with all of their data and ready to go. And we can do it a lot more efficiently, even a lot more economical than a lot of the services that exist out there right now. So in that sense, we're helping that company put much more money back towards its bottom end. But again, those are the benefits of technology. How much do I pay to upgrade? And once I upgrade, what I get back? And unfortunately, a lot of companies look at what's the cost today. And
Yes.
some of the companies are looking at it, what is my return in 10 years if I were to do this? And I think those are the companies that are moving ahead of some of the older companies.
Totally agree. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about your e-commerce component because presumably today, somewhere between the data shows, somewhere depending on the vertical, somewhere between 40 and 60% of manufacturers and distributors in the U.S. today still don't offer a self-service e-commerce portal to their customers, which is just
Correct.
wild in my mind. It's wild that as of 2026, you don't offer e-commerce in any meaningful way to your customers. Was that always a part of Erp.Aero, or is that a fairly recent addition to the platform to actually be able to offer an e-commerce storefront as part of the ERP solution?
Let me tell you a short story. It was a combination of the two, right? It may not have been part of day one design, but it slowly came into the design. I have an analogy I want to tell you about. I love it. It may or may not make sense. I hope it makes sense. But think about Erp.Aero as a pyramid, right? When you're looking straight at a pyramid, you only see the triangle. You don't see the other sides. You don't see anything else. But if you change your perspective a little bit, you see the other side of the pyramid. If you go to the other side, you see the third side of a pyramid, and so on. That whole analogy that makes sense, a lot of sense to me, is what Erp.Aero is. We are not just an ERP. We're more than just a tech provider. That same technology that offers the front end for our customers to manage their parts purchases and their repairs and everything in between is also a customer portal if you just turn it around. Once you rotate it a little bit, you've got something that most companies in this industry don't offer freely out of the gate, which is a customer portal. That's when the e-commerce store came in, because the e-commerce addition that we did over the years to Erp.Aero was a third side of that pyramid. It's not a third party. It's not a fourth party. It's not a separate payment system. It's not a separate customer management system. It's all part of Erp.Aero. Our ERP users see what they need to see to manage their customers, and they also see what they need to see in order to have their customers self-service or offer their products online. Because you're absolutely correct. I don't have a reason or an ability to explain why so many companies are not selling online when they very well should. But when you make that management simple, those are the changes that sort of took place between 2021 and probably 2 years ago, 3 years ago, when the product was almost complete, and then some of the changes that it went through. And we're able to offer those super quickly, directly in the ERP, no integration needed. A sale is accounted for right away. The inventory change is accounted for right away. Payment portal is part of the actual system. It's not yet another party. And we put all of that together and offer that to some of the customers that actually want to go down that road. But take all of those things together, and I think that's the long way of explaining to you where along the picture the e-commerce solution came into Erp.Aero.
And what, like, finger in the air, I don't expect you to have exact numbers off the top of your head, but what sort of percentage of your typical customer, say distribution customer that you work with, would bring their own e-commerce platform that they've already maybe made massive investments into and just simply want to integrate with Erp.Aero on the back end, versus what percentage come along and say, we don't do e-commerce today, but now that we've got Erp.Aero, we're going to start offering e-commerce. And then there's probably a third bucket there which says, we don't want to do e-commerce at all. We don't
Right.
give a shit. We
Right.
just want to use your ERP. We've got field sales reps. We've got teams. We got whatever. We got customer service. We got EDI. We got punch out. We got whatever. And we don't actually want to offer a portal at all to our customers. Are those the three main buckets of customers that you work with?
I don't want to sound overly simple, but yeah, those are the three. It's not a fit for all of our customers. If you do repairs, you're not offering e-commerce. If you're a strict manufacturer, you're not going to sell direct. You've got distribution, that's your outlet.
But you
That's where
might
you've
offer
got to go.
e-commerce to your distributors if you're a
Correct. And
manufacturer.
that's exactly the position where we come in. So our solution is currently for about 25 to 35% of our customers.
Mhm.
Those are the ones that fit the model where that store or that ability gives them a distinct advantage, versus just having a send us a quote request on their website.
Mhm.
Now they're able to offer either parts with pricing that you can sell right away, or expand their ability to be able to collect information from their customers to effectively make the sales that they need. And that turns out to be, like I said, about 25 to 35% of our customers that sort of fit that mold.
Love it. And then the remaining 60 to 70%, then that's probably pretty evenly split between roll your own or bring your own commerce and then integrate with Erp.Aero, versus some businesses that they're just going, we're not going to do e-commerce. We'll do EDI, but
Correct.
that's it.
Correct. And that's about right. It's about 60, 65% that fall into that bucket. But we also leave the door open for them. Erp.Aero has a fully capable open API, which means if you want to do e commerce, you don't have to use our solution, even though I think
Yes.
it's the best one. We can integrate with anybody else. We can integrate with any payment provider. We can integrate with anything that allows you to run that business. The benefit of having it all under one roof. Listen, if you do the math on a typical e-commerce rollout for, let's say, a $10 million company or $20 million company, it's high five figures, low six figures in order to go from A to Z. That's as best as I can get at it with
Yeah,
very
it can
fast.
be easily be
Correct.
200, easily
Correct.
be 200 grand, for example.
And then you take a small percentage of that and put together a turnkey solution that is a part of your ERP. I think it's a no brainer. So that's where it comes in. But again, some companies opt to do that and they can do whatever they want. It's their business. But we will continue to offer them these solutions that we think are ahead of their time, but more effective and ultimately can increase their margins.
I love that. I love that. And if you could sprinkle fairy dust on the aviation industry, you could snap your fingers and you could fix one thing or change one thing about the aviation industry, what would it be?
It's more of a personal thing. And let me explain to you what I mean. Aviation, I love it. I fell into it by accident about 20 years ago, and that's a story for another day. But it's such a part of what I am that I absolutely love it. The one thing that I would change, it is such a person to person driven industry where it that has its benefits, but unfortunately sometimes slows the progression of where things need to change. So maybe that's a selfish wish for me, but if I can sprinkle that fairy dust on the industry, affect any of the changes that I want, right or wrong, that would be one of them. To pick up the pace on new concepts, new ways of doing things, and new technologies, or how they're incorporated into everyday.
Love that. So, for example, drone technology, et cetera, where we're now in a world where seems like every state and municipality is coming up with their own drone rules and regulations, which seems to be slowing things down. But I guess it's similar to self-driving cars and everything else is having a national or international standard. It's just hard. It's
It is.
hard to bring that to market. So that's the reality of the industries we work in. Now, I will drop a link to your LinkedIn profile in the show notes, as well as the Erp.Aero website in the show notes. But other than that, how do you like people, if there's somebody in the industry who wants to learn a little bit more about your software or where you're headed or what you're doing, what's the best way to get a hold of you?
Directly is the best way. Can I give my number?
Of course, sure.
I can be called directly, not my assistant, not my department. I can be called directly at 305 209 3789. My email address is ralph dot merhi at erp.aero. And our website is erp.aero, AERO. The first one is the quickest one. It doesn't really matter what I do day to day. I wear about 16 hats on a typical week. I've done that for the last 20 plus years and I wouldn't really change it. So if you want to learn more, if you have questions, I promise you this: sail off the table. Let me answer some of the questions that you have. If it makes sense to you, you'll be in a position to control next steps. But until that happens, we'll gladly talk to you about anything that you want.
I absolutely love that. Absolutely amazing. Love the openness there. Now, as we do come down to the end of our time together, and an hour has rushed by here, it's been a fabulous conversation.
Wow.
I've learned a ton. This is the chance where I now get to flip the script. I now get to turn the microphone over to you. I get to let you ask me one question, any question you like. It could be personal or professional. Ralph Merhi from Erp.Aero, what is your question for me today?
I know you shared with me a place where you're going to that I'm not going to say unless you want to, but what would be your favorite go to place? I know I have one. It's a really simple place. It's actually the Florida Keys. That's where went for the first time when I was 16 or 17 years old. And that's the place I go back to as often as I can. What would that place be for you?
Look, that's such a good question, and it's a really tough one for me. Like I said, we traveled more in 2025 than and I've been traveling since I was pretty young. My grandparents actually, as a graduation present from high school, took me on a 7-day Caribbean cruise with them, and so I got a chance to see the Caribbean, which was absolutely amazing. And that really started truly. I got bit by the travel bug, and I grew up in Southern California. Moved to New Zealand in my early 20s, lived there for almost 30 years. My wife's a Kiwi, spent a lot of time in both New Zealand and Australia as a result. Now live in Mexico. So this is my third country I've ever lived in. And we continue to travel extensively around the world. And every place that I go to has its pros and has its cons.
Correct.
Every single place that we did in 2023, we spent all of 2023 driving around 20,000 kilometers driving around Mexico. We bought a car
Wow.
in Mexico City. I've seen more of Mexico than most people have. And again, in Mexico, there's some amazing places and some not so amazing places, but in general, it's an amazing country. And it's really hard for me to say love Bali, for example, but I wouldn't want to live there, for example. And funnily enough, I actually have friends that do live in Bali and they love living there. For me, it's a little bit too small and it's a little bit too remote. And it means I have to get on a plane to go anywhere. I can't just drive off the island. And for me, I didn't we spent a month in Europe in 2025, going to all the major European countries because I was there for a conference and then we just stayed on a little bit longer. I wasn't as impressed with the major European cities as I thought I was going to be. I'm not impressed with their immigration. I'm not impressed with their safety. I'm not impressed with the dirtiness of the major European cities. I was not impressed. And I'm not in a massive rush to go back. Now, countryside in France, for example, French countryside,
Beautiful.
beautiful. Italian countryside, beautiful. Major cities, not so beautiful. So it's super interesting. That's such a great question. We loved Turkey. We loved Morocco. We loved hiking in the Atlas Mountains. That was amazing. And meeting traditional Berber families and having lunch with traditional Berber families. That was
Wow.
absolutely incredible. Everything. And as I told you before we went live, my wife and I absolutely love Miami. And we have friends that live there. And we love the glitz and the glamour of Miami. But we'll probably never be able to afford to live there. But we love visiting there as tourists and spending days at a time there with the rooftop bars and the beauty of the evenings in Miami. And the food, the Latin food there
Amazing.
is just incredible. So, yeah, look, it's really difficult for me to just say one. But I tell you, the one thing I will say is if you want to develop your empathy gene, if you want to exercise that empathy muscle, if you want to see the world through other people's eyes, if you want to minimize the amount of ignorance you live in your life on a daily basis, traveling and living in other countries is the fastest way I know to do that. Like literally walking a mile in someone's shoes,
Yep.
literally going to the smallest towns of less than 1,000 people in Mexico, and all the way between that and Mexico City with 26 million people. And I've seen everything in between. That has given me a view of this country that I couldn't if I
You couldn't
only
get it.
went to if I only went to Cabo, or I only went to Cancun,
You
or if
don't
I
get
only
it.
went to Tulum or whatever. I wouldn't have the view of the Mexican culture that I have by seeing a good cross section of the country. So that would be my advice: is just travel early and as often as you possibly can, and just never stop.
I listen, maybe it's not the answer I was looking for, but it's a perfect answer. I think it speaks a ton. I appreciate you telling me that.
Thank you so much, Ralph. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you. Wish you every success with ERP.Aero, and I'm sure that we will cross paths at some sort of B2B conference at some stage in the future. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me on.
Are you a B2B or D2C e-commerce merchant? Then head over to greenwoodconsulting.net to learn how we can help you scale your business.